So, hello everyone. Welcome to episode 5 of our Echoes from the Field series. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Alex Richter, the founder of ThinkGeoEnergy, who are the leading news and research platform for the global geothermal energy sector. So, hello, Alex. Welcome. And please, could you introduce yourself and ThinkGeoEnergy to get us started?
Well, yeah, thanks for having me. Yeah, my name is Alexander Richter. I'm the founder of ThinkGeoEnergy, as you said, founded in late 2008 following the financial crisis. So it was an interesting story. And basically at that time, we saw that there was nobody covering geothermal. It was just too small of an industry and no news outlets covered geothermal. So we thought, why not do it and do it in a way that, let's say, gives a broader perspective of geothermal beyond the pure, let's say, subsurface and technology issues, but give a broader overview of geothermal from development to policy, financing, etc. Kind of like, I would say, an accidental entrepreneur creating a blog which becomes a news platform, and that's where we are today.
And still going strong, 17 or almost 18 years on. So it's obviously gone very well.
Indeed.
So congratulations on that front. Could you tell me a bit about your own experience in the geothermal sector?
Well, interesting enough is I came into geothermal through investment banking, which is probably a bit of a weird kind of access point. And as a lawyer by profession, I didn't have any technical background whatsoever, and I think that's been a blessing to a certain degree, and a challenge on the other end, because it made you curious. It made you curious about the different aspects of geothermal, but also giving you a broad perspective of, let's say, geothermal energy. And with that, I believe in many ways, we've become a little bit of a translator between the different
Hmm.
parts of geothermal. So from the pure technical side of things to, let's say, explaining this into sufficient depth to, let's say, politicians and investment bankers. And I think that's been something that was missing, because it's pretty much preaching to the own choir type of thing in geothermal. So that's kind of like, I guess, in a way, how we found our role, in the sense of becoming the translator between the different worlds.
So an interesting route into the geothermal sector. I think you've also had business development roles there as well, and still do.
Yeah. So,
Correct.
and yeah, of course. So in the end, I guess, of course, running in a niche market like geothermal, which of course it is, to run a media platform in a niche sector like this is, you have a challenge of scale. And of course, so this way I always needed to have a job on the side. So it's been pretty much a labor of passion. And I always had jobs on the side, both roles in marketing and, as of late, in business development for a geothermal developer for heat. And with that, you get a relatively good insight in both, let's say, the customer side of things, and where you're trying to sell and what are you trying to sell. And I think it's a unique kind of thing that you learn of the different aspects. And of course, that's how you come into contact with companies like STRYDE, that provided a solution for a seismic that's part of, let's say, a lot of the geothermal development in Europe.
What was the moment where you had that light bulb go off, which said, "Yeah, I want to commit myself to geothermal"? What was the trigger for that move?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, through investment banking, we were tasked kind of to look into renewable energy projects, and being based in Iceland, geothermal was a natural fit, and that's how we got started. And what I found super interesting is coming into an industry that's driven by the passion of individuals that have been trying to push geothermal for so many years. And it was a relatively small environment with a lot of people that kind of like are in geothermal for the pure passion of geothermal and the role it can play. And that I found extremely intriguing, and also being part, let's say, of the smaller world helped you create your network much faster. You got to know the doers, the makers, and you're very much closer to things. And in any other, let's say, larger industry, you have a much more challenging path ahead of you, which probably is defined by seniority and hierarchies. And geothermal, I guess, you needed to do everything, and you needed to connect with a lot of people. And that I found incredibly fantastic and interesting. And then, of course, learning more about the sector, being closer to things, you get a better understanding of this industry and its challenges. And global international aspect of it, all of that was super fascinating. That's where I kind of ended up in geothermal, and I've kind of never managed to get out of it, so to speak.
Hopefully you don't get out of it. There's so much potential there as well. But yeah, I'd have thought back then, hopefully you saw there's real potential to do this nearly everywhere and really help contribute to the world's heat and energy needs. I still feels to me like there's still a huge amount of potential. So as someone, I'm involved in geothermal, but probably not as deeply as yourself. It feels like it's come a long way since 2008, but there's still huge potential for growth in the future as well, which is exciting. Maybe let's talk about some of the trends you're seeing. So from your perspective, tracking geothermal projects worldwide and technology and everything else, which regions and countries are currently the hotspots for geothermal exploration development, and also why do you think that is?
That's a really good question, and of course, a question that I probably would have answered several years ago differently than I would do now. And it's difficult to say. So you have certain, of course, certain regions that are very, very, let's say, very visible in the current debate, and you have a lot of technology aspects. You have heat and power, and of course, all of that creates, let's say, a picture of the geothermal sector that's quite diverse, and that's a positive thing because it wasn't that diverse. You had, let's say, the hot regions of the world, the volcanic areas like Indonesia, the East African Rift Valley. You had the United States. And that was about it. And that has changed. So now you have, of course, in certain waves, you have Indonesia coming back strong in. So Indonesia is a very attractive and very important market at the moment. See Turkey waking up. Turkey is an incredibly interesting case study for geothermal of a country that has developed very fast and dramatically. Kenya is waking up again after, let's say, many years where it's been a little bit more quiet. But I think the main theme in geothermal today is, let's say, the technology-driven, US-focused kind of EGS, closed loop, kind of new technologies, super hot critical, etc. And let's say the heat story of Europe.
Yeah.
So when I would look at, let's say, the largest market potential, I would say is that at the one hand, let's say the traditional regions like Indonesia with high temperature resources, let's say larger project with a really impact on replacing coal-fired power generation. And then on the other hand, let's say the continued development in Africa. And of course, the United States and the new technologies, which creates a whole different scale perspective. So from, let's say, the 5 to 50 megawatt projects, all of a sudden we're talking about 100 to 1,000 megawatt projects, which of course we will have to see how that plays out. But it's created, like, let's say, a scale, a topic for geothermal that all of a sudden makes geothermal way more interesting than it was before. On the other hand, in Europe, it's less the technology, more the heat demand. And here the decarbonization efforts, and of course, energy security as well, trying to get rid of energy imports. And here the scale is moving into the project development, both traditional development, but also paired with heat pumps, and that going in parallel with an increased effort on thermal networks or district heating networks, where you create, let's say, a larger customer base like you would have in electricity. And so I would say it's on the one hand, let's say the traditional hot geothermal regions, like in Southeast Asia. It is the United States with the EGS and new technology and super hot critical. It's the heating story and large scale development across Europe. So France, Germany, going into Poland, UK as well, of course, but there's of course certain challenges. But this is the story today, and we hope that, I guess, with the with particular super hot rock potential, where in drilling costs are decreasing, you can drill deeper and then extract more energy. You could do geothermal everywhere, and that of course helps the scale of the potential for geothermal quite dramatically. How fast that will happen, we'll have to see.
Yeah, it's encouraging and heartening to hear you talk, because you've covered a large part of the world there where there's activity, and that's very positive. You mentioned the challenges of the UK as well. I'd like to dive into that in a bit more detail, because I feel a bit frustrated in a way. STRYDE's a UK headquartered company. We supply our systems for geothermal projects around the world, and we see lots of activity in Europe. aligning with what you're saying, but not so much in the UK. So I was interested in your perspective. Do you see the same thing, first of all? Do you see the UK lagging the rest of Europe a bit? And if so, why do you think that is?
Well, it's interesting. You have, of course, you have a strong history in oil and gas,
Mm,
and the Scottish experience in Aberdeen and all of that, the financial sector in London. So you have, let's say, many aspects of positive, a positive basis for geothermal development. You have a history. You have Romans using geothermal in Bath back centuries ago. You have done one of the first EGS projects in Cornwall back in the day. So there's a history. You have an incredibly entrepreneurial scene in the UK that is trying to push geothermal in the UK. And you have now also a government that is probably more interested in geothermal than it's ever been. How to really make and create a momentum out of it and help push, of course, is a different challenge. And of course, many things play into this. I mean, you don't have, let's say, a history of heating networks.
okay.
And that makes it difficult to implement projects. So you would need to do this in parallel. And that's, of course, a huge financial undertaking. Um, you have in Southampton, you have a project, a geothermal plant that's been operating for many years. So you have the EGS project in Cornwall, United Downs. You have the Eden project. So you have some really nice, let's say, pilot projects that kind of show that it's possible. And to get that to go over the next step, that's the important part. So you have a strong subsurface expertise in the UK. You have companies like yours that know what they're doing. You have a strong heat demand base. You have limited, let's say, policies that would support geothermal. And that, of course, many people work on that. Geothermal UK, the different organizations, etc., are working on that to kind of push that. There's a super interesting report recently released on the geothermal potential for the UK. Of course, that helps, but you need the real steps to make it happen. And as I said before, the district heating is slower in the UK, that rollout. That needs to be pushed more because it would help, let's say, on a more concerted effort
Mm,
to push for renewable heating. And that it will always be a mix, and geothermal can be a part of it. But these district heating networks are an important part for that to get started, because you need to create that demand, because a little 5 megawatt heating plant will not do the trick. You need bigger demand, and that you create through bigger networks, bigger customers. So for that, basically, you need clear long-term revenue certainty for the developers, be it, let's say, a heating utility or a utility that operates the district heating network, etc. That's what you need. Similar like an electricity distribution network creates a market for anyone that wants to sell electricity.
mm.
And then it's a matter of cost and the price. So that's challenging. So in UK, I would say policy is a big aspect. It's a long-term commitment by the government, and not only the government, but politics in general, from like cross the political spectrum, to really help push, let's say, a natural resource that you have and decarbonize the heating sector. And their geothermal is unbeatable. And that's where policy plays a big part in that. So I would say you have good industry, you have great players, you have a financial sector that could come in and support, and some of them do, but not in the UK, unfortunately.
No.
And then you need to create, let's say, revenue models for developers and policy support. I think that's the main challenges for the UK at the moment.
And it sounded like you do see positive government engagement on this, because that's something I've wondered about. How bought in is the UK government to geothermal? But you made some positive sounds there that there are things happening.
Well, I mean, we also have to look at where we're coming from in geothermal.
Yeah.
And of course, the expectations have always been very low because we've been not that visible. We've not been taken serious. We've never had a real big scale story to tell. And that has changed. So it has created a broader interest in geothermal. And all of a sudden, people make that connection between the oil and gas sector and geothermal, and the potential of what the oil and gas sector can do to help geothermal, but at the same time help the oil sector to create a bit of a different purpose in life than
Yeah.
kind of drilling after fossil fuels. That connection is very interesting, and we see it. I mean, I just recently reposted a story of a Canadian oil worker that was sick and tired of these, let's say, irregular stays on the oil platforms in the North Atlantic, and
Right.
is now drilling for geothermal heat in Toronto, and kind of like how it has changed his life, because he's onshore, more regular working hours, and it
Yeah.
changed his life for the better. And of course, doing something more on the green side helps as well. And these are the stories we need to tell, and that's quite exciting, I think. And for
Yeah.
that, like, I'm quite optimistic for the UK that you have the people, you have the sector.
Yeah, it should happen. Hopefully it will. What are the major market trends you think people should be looking at in the geothermal sector over the next 3 to 5 years? What's exciting that people should be staying abreast of?
I mean, we see a lot of talk about geothermal. There is an understanding of policymakers that geothermal will play a role and needs to play a role in the energy strategy for the future. And that is new. And we as a sector, we need to be firm on what we have to offer. And at the same time, kind of also point to the that will help us get over the threshold of actually putting money to work in drilling. So risk mitigation tools are something that's been talked a lot about in any aspects, and here guarantees, insurance schemes, etc., are talked a lot. But the challenge is like, it's better to have a bad program than having an over-designed, fantastic program that comes too late.
Yeah.
And you need certainty, and that's a very important part. So we see the challenge, for example, in Germany, which by definition has a fantastic scenario. Government is for it. It has talked about a risk insurance tool for now over 2 years, and with that, investment has stalled because everybody's waiting for it to happen. There's always called the law of the unintended consequences. If you have a risk mitigation tool, just roll it out immediately without it being perfect, because it's better to have a clear line of how it looks like, rather than having something over-designed that takes 3 years to develop. And the crossover from oil and gas will happen even more so. We see it with EGS. Here, the stimulation and fracking experience here being applied in the United States. How far we can do it in the urban areas in Europe is, of course, a different challenge, a different story. So EGS and super hot rock and even closed loop create a different narrative for geothermal, allowing geothermal to be developed in areas that are maybe not traditional geothermal areas. With that comes the challenge of how we sell that. And we will see regional differences. So we see a way more heat-focused discussion on geothermal in Europe versus a way more, let's say, technology, power-driven discussion in Southeast Asia, Africa, and in the United States. But we also see an increased decarbonization efforts in the industrial heat. So industry players will play a way more direct role in producing heat for their operations. We see this in Germany, where both car manufacturers and others actually are drilling their own wells for heat production for their operations. And there are way more stronger public funding structures now in place. And here we see that, let's say, the different financial aspects of geothermal financing increasingly are growing together, and it becomes more clear who plays a role in what part of the development chain. And hopefully we can then bridge that still existing gap between, let's say, the venture capital, high return expectation and the new technologies and the classic venture capital, to, let's say, the infrastructure, more project financing focused kind of funding, which is of course cheaper, more long-term. And there's still a little bit of a gap, and we need to bridge this. And that's where politics can come in with risk mitigation tools and public funding tools to kind of help develop, to bridge those gaps to make things happen. So I guess policy support, oil and gas crossover, the new technologies, heating over power in Europe are, let's say, the major trends I would see.
Okay, thank you. When it comes to scaling geothermal, because I think you've touched on a lot of places have got pilots already, hopefully successful pilots. Certainly in my view, there's a big scaling challenge now. What do you see as the key barriers which are holding back global scaling of geothermal, and how might we overcome them? And you've touched on some already, but yeah, what do you think?
I mean, if I look into my experience as a business developer, of course, one of the challenges that you see is data availability, and which goes into subsurface risk perception.
Mhm.
So understanding where are resources, what risks are involved to extract them or to find them, etc. And of course, that's where a company like STRYDE with your nodes and the seismic campaigns plays an important role. So technology helping to evaluate those resources, to find those resources and make it readily available into, let's say, public databases that people and investors can access to see where is a fit between the resource and the demand.
Yeah, and that's relatively easy to solve, or at least to me, it seems a relatively easy problem to solve. And I do see it being solved in some places. So yeah, let's hope we see progress there.
No, indeed, but also kind of then the notion of making this publicly available.
Yes.
Different stories in Denmark, for example, all that data that's been collected essentially is being made public, and you can go to a website and by the click you have it, so you can evaluate this quite quickly. In Germany, you need to apply for it. Then the oil companies that had done these seismic studies might not be willing to share their analysis, and all of that is, of course, challenging. And making this readily available is an important part. It's a tricky thing. Another key barrier, I guess, to kind of continue would be the high upfront drilling cost. That's a big challenge and will continue to be a big challenge. Of course, EGS, by scaling, making these projects larger on site, helps kind of like each additional well to be cheaper because you know better where you drill, how you drill, etc. And you have a more scaling effect of drilling on the same location. Of course, if you have smaller projects, more distributed, it's a bit challenging to decrease the drilling cost. But of course, drilling technology, etc., could help with that. Key barrier still is, like, say, inconsistency on some policies. Talked about this in the UK context, but it's really understanding kind of who owns the heat, who owns the water resource, how quick can you get permits to drill, um, and public perception is then important as well. We have the situation in Germany, for example, where there's a big opposition towards geothermal project development in some areas, while at the same time there's an oil drilling rig a few kilometers away and there's nothing, and you're like,
Yeah.
so things like that. And still to that day, you have long development timelines. And that, of course, makes it also tricky. I mean, of course, you need a lot of money to start. But of course, if it drags out kind of when you would get the first cash flow, that doesn't help investors either. So how can we decrease permitting timelines, etc., to get projects quicker off the ground is a big issue. And the other big key barrier, I touched upon this earlier, is financing. And it's how can we attract financing across the different phases of geothermal development. So from the early equity investments to reaching the level of development where you can qualify for debt financing is a crucial aspect. Because debt financing, by that term, would be the cheapest funding available for a developer. And equity is, of course, more expensive. And the problem is that given the basis of a resource-based business model for geothermal is you need that high cost capital that you need to apply at the beginning of the project, which comes at a very high cost. And that's counterproductive in the returns, and it's counterproductive to the price we can offer for the competitiveness. And here, I guess in many bases, and I don't know how it's in the UK, but we've seen this again and again, that even though geothermal is a resource business, just like oil and gas, it's not receiving the same tax credits or tax incentives, etc., as oil and gas. And that's where we need to create a level playing field. And it's either creating that level or given geothermal, let's say, a certain tax advantage, given the opportunity it provides in decarbonizing, and that's a policy decision.
It's interesting actually because you've listed a number of very valid barriers, and another thing as you were talking, which occurred to me, is the current status or answer to each of those is different in each country. So even if you get to a stage where, say, data ownership is resolved in France and you've got a good permitting mechanism, that's not to say another nearby country will have the same policies. So it's very fragmented, what I would say. There's different rules and regulations in different countries, and that if someone's looking at scaling geothermal, say a corporation is looking at scaling it globally, it makes it even harder that you've got different rule sets in each location.
And this is a challenge. This is a challenge today in geothermal. Like, and I've touched upon this earlier. Like, I mean, in power generation and in heat generation, you don't have companies that work globally, applying that know-how and that experience to international project development. The only company that does it is Ormat, a turbine producer that is now also the largest geothermal operator. Otherwise, you have these local companies drilling in their area, and that expertise is lost because they don't take this abroad.
Yeah.
So you have the straight experiences from Paris, and they don't apply this going to Germany or the UK and it's mind-boggling that kind of like, but it's of course understandable. So that international collaboration and to see how can we utilize that experience elsewhere is so important. And that's done currently through of course, consultants and companies like yours that work internationally, but it doesn't make it easier, unfortunately.
No, I think the positive is there's a lot of people who want to collaborate, who are very motivated to see geothermal succeed in the industry. So that natural collaboration's there, and often it's the policies and regulations which make it harder to work together. But I think the people are in the industry, and there's the potential that it will succeed. And for me, it's more a question of how and when rather than if. If you could talk to governments and investors on maybe 3 actions that would significantly accelerate geothermal deployment, what would you advise them to do?
Putting my business developer hat on, I mean, I think one of the most important aspects, I mentioned it before, is creating, let's say, a very clear, firm policy structure and stick to it.
Oh.
Not constantly divert and saying, yeah, there people talk about we should do it better and this. And no, if you have a policy and it's okay, then just stick to it and it give a certain perspective to develop. But this is how it is, and that's what we have to deal with. Not give the intention like we might do this, because then everybody waits.
Uncertainty. Yeah.
So supporting policies, yes, but do it quickly and stick to it.
Yep.
So it's better to have a not perfect policy, but you have a certainty rather than aiming for something better and greater and then postpone it. And that has happened in Turkey. That has happened in Indonesia. We've seen so many examples. So that's point 1. Point 2 is data availability. Be really firm on that. You make data available, that people can quickly evaluate this. So if you have permits given out on, let's say, certain areas, like an exploration license for oil and gas, that at least part of that data is being made available to geothermal development. Of course, not for a competitor that kind of could save something, but make sure that this data becomes available for something that you provide as a license. And that also helps. Make it available electronically for better and quicker evaluation, for resource assessments, etc. And thirdly, financing. It's all about the money. Create a structure where investment firms are incentivized in the different aspects of financing for geothermal, from the early phases to, let's say, the debt financing, so infrastructure, and allow private sectors players to come in. So I mentioned the law of the unintended consequences is, of course, if you're providing financial tools and structures for, let's say, city utilities, they might be inclined to do it themselves rather than having a private investor come in because he's perceived too expensive, even though he has the experience. And now they can do it themselves. And that might not be the money best spent because they might not get the best consultant to do it right. and to do it quick. So it's always a little bit of a challenge here. And by doing, let's say, things too much by government support, you also kind of like move away from, let's say, quick development, and maybe you're taking risks that shouldn't be taken, which normally the private sector would kind of decide. And it's the tricky thing.
Let's talk about some success stories. So things that are going well already. Based on your research and projects you've either been involved in or you've followed, which geothermal projects stand out as success stories, and what made them successful?
Well, there are, like, let's say there are several really interesting projects worldwide that kind of show, let's say, kind of how it can look like. And now I would take Turkey as a really good example. I mean, Turkey is not a country with which, yes, it has geothermal resources, but it doesn't have, let's say, the high temperature resources of East Africa or Southeast Asia, for example. But they've managed with a policy structure and tariff clarity. So they had a very attractive tariff structure that provided a feed-in tariff, a very, very favorable feed-in tariff. Of course, there's some currency issues in that as well, but it was very attractive. And that's how a lot of the conglomerates, the different business conglomerates in Turkey were investing into geothermal. And from 60 megawatt in 2008 to, let's say, 2022, they developed up to 1,700 megawatts of power generation. And that's remarkable. And it shows that kind of if you have a scheme that provides a certainty and an attractive model, that you can develop things that quickly. These are mostly low temperature resources or lower temperature with binary cycle power plants, but that pushed kind of Turkey into the top 10 of the geothermal countries of the world and into the 1 gigawatt club very quickly. And it shows what can be done. At the same time, in Indonesia, you have this more gradually, and you have certain dips that show that it's challenging, and it's here basically an uncertainty about PPAs, power purchase agreements, and tariffs, etc. But here there is a really interesting example as well. I mean, with all the challenges in the Southeast Asian development, the Sarulla project, a big project by a multinational joint venture, basically also developed like a 330 megawatt big power project, utilizing local support, local experience, paired with investors from Japan, turbine suppliers from Japan and the US. And in the end, basically that consortium rebuilt geothermal power projects. There are two smaller projects, Marualabo and Rantau Dirap, that here with a French and an Indonesian player, also showing that international collaboration can work. So these are really good and interesting examples. In Kenya here, same thing, supported by the World Bank and others. Here the development banks played a big role, but here the development of Olkaia, also very, very interesting and very important. And let's say a lesser known success story is the geothermal heating development in Paris. And I say lesser known is due to the fact that these are small projects, local projects, but in combination, it presents today probably one of the largest geothermal district heating networks, if you were to put it together. And it's something that people don't know, but it's done in the city, and you have these pictures of drilling rig within the city, and it's fantastic, and nobody talks about it, but it's a fantastic success story. And of course, we see a similar development now in Denmark and in Germany, where this is being developed in cities, and hopefully that can also then be the success stories that we need. But and last but not least, also in Dominica now in the Caribbean. I mean, it's been a long road, but the first plant is now coming online in March, I think, of this year. It's not the first in the region, but it's one of these small island projects that is small in size. I think it's 10 megawatts. But the impact for a small island like this, to have a hurricane resilient power plant, to have a local resource, you don't need to move in a diesel for power generation. I mean, environmentally and cost-wise and energy security. These are the remarkable projects that we maybe don't talk enough about, but they are, of course, playing such an important role locally.
Thank you for sharing those. Some great projects in there. What about projects which didn't go quite so well? The industry, I think, at times has had quite high expectations in some markets, and that hasn't always turned into real projects that are delivering. Without necessarily getting specific projects, do you see common reasons that geothermal initiatives struggle or don't quite deliver what was promised?
Be careful a little bit because I'm working on a report right now that touches
Okay.
exactly upon that. But let's take Africa, for example. I mean, you have in certain projects in Africa the challenge of, let's say, political uncertainty. You have local security issues. You have issues of, let's say, a legislation that was set up that was not made for geothermal, but was not taking, let's say, local challenges into consideration in the regulations that are set up. So finding a power purchase agreement with the power off-taker here, a national energy company, has been challenging. And we see this again and again. I mean, there are several countries in Africa and beyond where that power purchase agreement and that tariff has been a challenge. It's the same, like I mentioned this earlier, with Indonesia. Here, it was great. It was set up. There's a tariff system and so on. But the problem was tailored towards known regions with let's say, a clearer cost structure. So you could kind of calculate a tariff that was favorable, but still interesting enough for investors. But then going beyond that in areas where the resource isn't as good or whatever, you need to kind of build roads into the jungle, creates a different cost structure, and that was not taken into consideration. So all these kinds of little challenges. I mean, we could also look into challenges in one of the projects in the UK, or two of the projects in the UK that took much longer time to develop. There were all kinds of things to overcome, be it local support, public perception, policy support, technical challenges. So some of these projects have dragged on for way too long. And luckily, this will now happen, and we're very close in Cornwall, which is fantastic. But it shows that kind of like, even if you have the experience and all that set up, you can have all these little roadblocks that delay projects. And often we see projects that kind of have funding for one well.
Yeah.
And that one well isn't successful. Then to turn around and raise money again for a second well becomes even more challenging than raising money for the first well. So a lot of projects we've seen getting to that stage and then never happen. And that's the wrong part. You need a portfolio approach where you have money for several wells. And I mean, a good example is one of the companies that I worked for, where, let's say, the expectations were not met by the first well, but it was decided to move on right to the next one. And that was then beyond the expectations. And it shows, by having the stamina and the funding to go through with this, you can create a successful project. So yeah, it's a matter of perception, what you see as successful. But of course, every well that you drill, you learn so much more about the subsurface. And that's where governments come in to kind of make sure that data that is not lost in projects that are not successful, because they can be a great tool for successful drilling going forward.
That makes sense. Yeah, anecdotally, I hear of other kind of unintended consequences, like you'll have funding for drilling a well, like you've just said, but that doesn't apply to the seismic you want to do before you drill, and hence someone uses their funding, drills a well without seismic, and then it's a bit of a lottery of what will happen. So yeah, unfortunately, I've met a few companies who've drilled without seismic, come up with a bad well, and that's killed forward momentum. And often it was just because there was funding available to drill, but not to do subsurface characterization before you drill. Which
I mean, this is a point. This is a point exactly. It's like, how do you de-risk projects?
Yeah.
And there are, of course, different tools. And of course, I mean, you know this better than I do, in the sense of where does seismic make sense and where not. And of course, a developer has to value the cost involved. And that's where governments can come in and say, listen, we want to decarbonize heating in, let's say, in Edinburgh or in Newcastle. And we, as the city, we support that by funding a seismic campaign. You get some consultants that kind of like make sure that here's the demand. This is what we need to do. And this is done now in Berlin for example, where Berlin basically decides, okay, we do that seismic, and with that, hopefully we can define where it makes sense to drill.
Yeah.
And with that, de-risk projects for a private developer to start with. And that makes it super, super interesting. And to see these seismic trucks and to see your nodes in action is of course super exciting. And to see then the data that helps make companies' drilling decisions better is important. But it's always, if you're purely thinking Excel exercise and so on, that's of course challenging.
That's cool. Let's go on to the role of seismic and subsurface understanding. What, from your perspective, what role does seismic data play in the overall geothermal development cycle?
So I guess in the context, if you look at this heating projects that look at hydrothermal resources or even the new technology with closed loop, where you need to get a better understanding of the subsurface, seismic is a non-invasive tool and option to learn more about the underground to make better informed decisions. And I think this is why seismic campaigns are utterly important, particularly in the heating context, because drilling, let's say, in urban environments, you need to be quite sure of where you drill with all the costs involved in securing the drilling site, etc. Even though you can deviate by directional drilling, etc., it's still quite important to have a better understanding of how this looks like. Then again, I mean, with new technologies like AI here on machine learning and so on, to be able to quicker evaluate the data that is being collected manually, which of course with seismic you need to do, this becomes an incredibly fantastic tool. And of course, I would assume that seismic and the data quality has improved dramatically in the past, let's say 10, 15 years. So that the data quality that you get is much better. And how to plug this together with resource estimates of geologists and the developer, and how to plug this together and that data. We are in a period where that different aspects and data points coming together can create an incredible opportunity for geothermal development worldwide, and that becomes interesting.
Nice, that's very helpful. Can you give examples of where having seismic has really altered a project's duration or outcome or direction, whether that's for good or bad or not?
I am at least know that in the context of, I mean, and I think this is public, in the context of Denmark, for example, here, the seismic was important to define drilling locations.
Yeah.
So paired with the availability of district heating network and distribution lines versus where you find the resource and where you can set up a drilling site, seismic was a crucial aspect. And then I guess that applies both to these projects in Aarhus in Denmark, but also I guess for the seismic I think that you were involved with in Copenhagen. So here clearly that defines a drilling decision by a company. Elsewhere, I think in Germany, a lot of seismic campaigns have defined project locations. And now with Berlin, it also becomes very important because so little is known about the geology below the city. So it's utterly important and helps make projects successful, or at least make a drilling decision, because you can't predict the water and permeability either. You are at least a large part of making that decision, this informed decision, much easier.
Yeah, I think the other things people tell us, so there is a big bit about de-risking and where to put your well. A lot of people are interested in the hazards, if you like, the drilling hazards. What to avoid is as important as the potential, so that comes across as well. And then you can often infer the permeability, etc. So there's certainly our clients or indirect clients. Those are the main reasons they give us. But the huge one is making sure you put your well in the right place and avoid bad wells. As you've highlighted already, that the cost of a well is such a big part of the upfront costs that you really want to get it right, and it's worth spending. It doesn't take long to run a seismic campaign nowadays. It doesn't cost that much, but it's worth the small upfront investment to de-risk the much bigger drilling investment and decision. Looking at the sector and the long term, how close are we to the point where geothermal becomes a mainstream part of many energy strategies globally? Are we close to that point, or do you think there's still a way to go?
I mean, we have to be fair. I mean, currently, in the overall energy context, geothermal is a minuscule part
Yeah.
of the overall energy picture. As I said, it's different in different countries, like in Kenya, where geothermal represents 50% of electricity generation. Of course, then is a different scale. In other countries, less so. But I guess heating and decarbonization, carbonization of heating has put geothermal into a different sphere.
Yeah.
And that shows why geothermal is so important in the energy discussions in Europe right now, for example. So we have that opportunity as a sector today to kind of build upon that that interest and provide also to politicians the message that we can actually scale. So we can be more than the little 5 megawatt project. And that's where new technology comes in, and how far that can be applied to heating, of course, will have to be seen. But these new technologies, EGS, closed loop, and super hot rock, kind of expand the market for geothermal dramatically. So both geographically, from, let's say, away from the pure, let's say, volcanic type of geothermal systems of the past, still today, but what I mean is like where we've seen most of the development. So it becomes way more attractive. And then paired with heat pumps on the heating side of things, where you can use low temperatures, that expands the opportunities in the market dramatically for geothermal. And with that, for the first time in many, many years, we have a story of scale to tell. And with that, we become interesting. And now we need to prove it, that we can do it. So these projects that are now in the commercial pilot phase are super important for us as a sector to show that we can reach scale, for politicians to lean out of the window to support geothermal, but at the same time also for the oil and gas and service companies to invest into geothermal. I think the time is now, and I look at this in probably the most optimistic way ever in my time in geothermal. So it's super exciting.
Yeah, I share that optimism, and I'm seeing a lot happening. And as you say, now we just need to deliver. But I don't see any reason why we won't deliver. So I'm very hopeful. We're entering a golden age, a golden era for geothermal. Let's start closing out. What advice would you give to both young professionals and innovators considering entering geothermal today?
This touches upon something I've mentioned before in another discussion, is that I think one of the important things is that we need to keep people in the geoenergy sector. And I'm very specific to mention it as a geoenergy sector, because it includes not only geothermal, it includes storage, it includes CCS, etc. So all these things that kind of relate to the subsurface know-how that we've had in mining and oil and gas exploration. So the geosciences are incredibly important. And we see that there's a decreasing interest of young people joining the geosciences programs. And that's a big danger for us in geothermal and for the energy sector as a whole. So subsurface fundamentals will remain incredibly important. But the other aspect, and I mean, personally, I can say that, I mean, I did a master in a cross-functional kind of master program, which gave me a different perspective on things, being a lawyer by profession. And I think that's also the part, is that you need to understand your core, what you do, so subsurface fundamentals, but also understand the context where it fits in. So we will see an increasing, let's say, specialization, and yet that aspect of understanding where you fit into the overall energy discussion and scheme. So really understanding, let's say, also financing to some degree, to understand where do you fit in. And of course, also in geoscience, you need to be patient. I think that's also very important. And don't expect things to happen very quickly. So it's very important, I think, to think long term and systematically. I think that's very important. And at the end of the day, the geoenergy sector, kind of rewards competence over hype.
Good advice. I think other
So I
things I'd
think that's
highlight, it's clearly a growing sector, which if I was choosing a career, the fact if you take geoenergy as a whole, maybe it's stable or in some industries declining. But if you look at geothermal, it's clearly growing and I think it'll continue to grow. A lot of the players, so there are some larger companies getting involved, but there's lots of smaller companies. And if you're early in your career being in one of those smaller companies, you get a lot of the exposure you mentioned. You get to yes, you might be a geoscientist, but you're connecting with the people who need to sort out project financing, project management, etc. So a great opportunity for exposure. And as we've said, it's a really good time to be coming into this industry. There's a lot of potential and hopefully a lot of growth in the coming years. So,
And indeed, and then let's say another aspect, and I think that's also very important, given that we were so small as a sector. Let's say the share of, let's say, marketing, finance, and business individuals that were part of the sector was too small of a market. So we see now a lot of new talent coming in because the sector is growing, and that is helping us as a sector. I mean, I guess you see it in your company with a fantastic marketing team. Kind of this is talent to attract would have been much more difficult, let's say years ago.
yeah.
So by being a growing sector, you are attracting more talent in the different aspects that you need as part of your industry as well, be it marketing, finance, business, etc. And that's super fantastic to see. So seeing people coming in with fresh ideas, with new technical capabilities, with AI or software know-how. I mean, this shows that we are now a growing sector and it becomes interesting. And so for that matter, it's not just the geosciences, it's all the other sectors we need to get in as well. So not to all those young professionals kind of coming in from other sectors. Yes, so we need you in all kind of angles of our sector.
Yeah, and I've phrased my question around young professionals, innovators, but there's people who are experienced in their career who maybe have spent a career in oil and gas. In some places, that industry's reducing headcount, etc. There's people who are looking for jobs who've got experience that's highly relevant for geothermal, but maybe haven't looked that way. So it's worth that group looking at geothermal as well. One
Indeed,
last
yeah.
question. Looking ahead, what keeps you most excited about the future of geothermal?
I mean, we've seen, let's say, the oil and gas sector come and go in geothermal,
Yeah.
and it's the first time that I'm quite optimistic that this time the oil and gas sector will stay in geothermal. I mean, that the overall market in the energy sector is quite dynamic. So I guess the oil sector needs to have a second leg somewhere else or a
Good.
foot into the market. So that's why I'm very optimistic that geothermal will continue a part of the oil and gas sector. And I hope that stays with investments. That's now, of course, always a bit of a challenge, but we see that this is quite important and quite fantastic that to see that know-how coming in and being applied and the sector showing interest. The other part is that district heating is increasingly discussed also in other countries. I mean, I was joking a little bit that kind of district heating would be too socialist of a concept in the North American context, but even there, it's seen as a fantastic tool to have an impact on the energy sector, I know, both with energy security, etc. So that's important. We also see that certain developers are more transparent about sharing data.
Yeah.
So the data share, for example, by the EGS developers in the United States is super interesting and it's going to help the sector quite a bit. So that's also a very positive thing, and really makes me excited. And I hope we see more of that kind of data sharing and transparency, which helps the sector grow beyond, let's say, individual projects in the US and these stronger pipelines that we see today. This is also super exciting. We see, let's say, a more sustainable and stable project pipeline. We see larger projects in the pipeline. than before, and a diverse pipeline. And that's super interesting. And I hope that this will also continue for heating in Europe, but it's quite optimistic. And of course, the growing institutional awareness for geothermal. We see it with the nonprofit organizations coming in and establishing themselves around geothermal, creating more hype, more interest, more access to philanthropic funding, to governments, access to government. You've seen this recently in the UK with Project Innerspace, or in the US as well, and certain interest groups going into, let's say, super hot rock, etc. So this we've never had before, and the political interest, and that's why I'm super excited for geothermal at the moment.
And so am I. That's a great place to pause. So thank you very much for a very enjoyable and enlightening discussion, Alex. I'd really encourage people who are listening to check out ThinkGeoEnergy if they don't already, just to stay abreast of what's happening in the industry and across the whole sector. And with that, I'll say thank you to everyone for taking the time to listen and watch us. And thank you again, Alex.
Thank you.